welcome to everyone who's here. And my name is Dan Mayer. I'm a retired professor of emergency medicine from Albany Medical College, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. We're going to talk about EBM and what's its relevance now, and how do we use it in emergency medicine, and how does it fit in with all the changes in the healthcare system that we've been seeing. I want to start off with a very brief history of evidence-based medicine in 2 minutes. Specifically, how did emergency medicine take a leadership role in this process? The history of evidence-based medicine, there's a clear line from the ancient Greek empiricist philosophers to James Lind in 1750, PCA Louis in 1830, John Snow in 1850, Austin Bradford Hill in 1950, David Eddy in 1980, and he was the one who finally coined the term evidence-based medicine that year. And you guys can read about that somewhere else. But in emergency medicine, we had emergency medicine abstracts, also known as the Rick and Jerry Show, that began in 1980 and was presented by two ER docs, Jerry Hoffman, who was an expert in critical appraisal, and Rick Bucata, who was a practicing community doc who discussed the application and implementation of that evidence. Emergency medicine has been leading the movement in what I would call classical evidence-based medicine, which means searching for the best evidence at the point of care, and critical appraisal of the evidence wherever, either at the point of care or through journal clubs, peer review, or any other area. And we're going to present our discussion. We have a panel of EBM experts who are going to talk about where EBM is headed, and especially specifically in emergency medicine. I'm going to start off by introducing Peter Wyer from Columbia University, a professor of emergency medicine, and who will talk about EBM training. And Peter, you have been involved in teaching EBM teachers, both at the New York Academy of Medicine in the 1990s and at McMaster University and Oxford University, and teaching how to teach evidence-based medicine. But you became part of EBM, basically the movement from the very beginning of its resurgence. However, many of your recent publications have been critical of that framework. What aspects of the EBM framework proved most disappointing to you over time? And I'll let you elaborate then.
Well, thank you. I was drawn to the EBM movement early on, and particularly because of the emphasis on strengthening the scientific basis of clinical practice, which, of course, has become an even more salient mission recently than it was then. And I should clarify that when I say EBM, I'm talking about evidence-based medicine, a phrase coined by Gordon Guyatt actually, and put forward as an educational initiative of 1992 through the JAMA series, User's Guides. And I think it's useful to really define what you're talking about when you talk about EBM. Well, that's what I mean. And I was drawn to it because, as an educator, because it seemed to offer an approach to clinical problem solving, which was innovative, scientifically founded, and well-intentioned. And over a period of 20 years, I and colleagues I worked with put forward the EBM perspective. And by that perspective, I mean the whole mantra as it was introduced, the ask, appraise, acquire, ask, acquire, appraise, apply formula, which started with asking questions at the bedside or in the course of clinical care. And in workshops in 3 continents and workshops that we designed in New York, we really put forward that entire framework, not just critical appraisal. And that was actually different from what was being done in many, if not most, EBM workshops around. And what I encountered over a long period of time, and you can call me a slow learner, is that the EBM formula for deriving questions from practice and formatting them and turning them into search protocols was very non-commensurate with the way clinicians think. And clinicians do not, and clinical learners particularly, do not think the same way as researchers and clinical epidemiologists. They think in an integrated way, not in an analytical, breaking things down way. And we actually showed what we called the initiation skills, which, if you can't do that, you can't do any of it meaningfully, has to do with, can a learner, an EBM learner, can they derive a question from clinical practice, as opposed to being given an article to appraise? Now, we actually did a study on that in New York, and we found that they couldn't. Given a multifaceted scenario, they were unable to derive a question, put it into a format, and then generate a search protocol out of it. And that was rather sobering, but it was another 10 or 15 years before we figured out that it really didn't work that way. And I guess that's the main point I want to make there, that clinical thinking is different from analytical research thinking. And if you're trying to teach doctors, people who want to be doctors or nurses or other types of practitioners, to do this, you're going to have to do it in a way that is very different from the original orthodoxy of the EBM mantra. And I guess I'll stop there.
All right. So how do you see those shortcomings in that EBM movement becoming ameliorated in the coming years? And what role do you see AI playing in this process?
Well, again, I think the original mission is more important than ever before. And I think from a standpoint of clinical education, resident education, for example, what one needs to recognize that the clin-epi aspect, what I call the clinical epidemiology aspect of EBM, which is the kind of the core of critical appraisal, that I believe that the current medical school curriculum adequately covers that, and covers it in a way that people who are coming out of medical school into residency already have gotten as much as they're going to meaningfully acquire, unless they're going into research or public health or epidemiology. And I think we need to start from that standpoint. What one needs to do is to consider ways of creating communities of practice within a residency program in such a way that the framework is contextualized, rooted in practice experience, with less emphasis on critical appraisal of epidemiology and much more emphasis on how information from research potentially blends into the clinical practice environment. I've posted on the chat a couple of references. One, which is a report of an initiative we started in New York, and which I briefly reported on a year ago at one of the SAEM didactic sessions. And I also posted the information on Jean LeVay's very important book, Situated Learning, which is really the foundations of the community of practice concept. On a larger level, on the implementation science level, I think we also need to move into a kind of different approach. And there are some very innovative approaches which draw upon interpretive conceptions, also sometimes called hermeneutics, that are actually coming online now, being reported in the literature, which get away from here's what I know and what I know you should do, and here's how I think you should do it, to a more interactive, iterative, socially situated approach. And AI, I think, can play a big role here, because it potentially, depending on how it's motivated and how it's designed, I think it's capable of doing something that maybe UpToDate does in a more crude fashion. It could partially contextualize information from research, perhaps linking it into access to your system, and actually put information in a form that clinicians can relate to, as opposed to requiring a translational process from research thinking to clinical practice thinking. I see Ken is on now. Maybe he can comment on that also.
We'll get to Ken in a little bit, but I want to first give Eddy a chance to talk about evidence at the point of care and just-in-time learning practice guidelines. So my question, Eddie, is what are some EBM resources that you found helpful for your learners, and how useful are these at the bedside during a clinical shift?
Thanks, Dan. And it's such a great thing to be part of this panel and this session. This is a rapidly moving target. And what we are seeing is that while we've relied on standard resources such as UpToDate and other kinds of reference material, the introduction of AI has changed the landscape considerably with the way we can query clinical questions at the bedside. Or more realistically, when we're during some off time or teaching time, tools that come to mind, and I have no proprietary interest in any of these, are open evidence. And one resource that's well known to us as a group because of its innovative and evidence-based approach is something called the TRIP database out of the UK, turning research into practice. They've created a new AI platform just simply called Ask. And although, we have to think a bit cautious about these AI-based tools, they're not free from error or the challenges of AI like hallucination. In general, I think they are continuing to improve over time. And I think we can envision a day where we can, especially with so many of us on an electronic health record, we can see opportunities for not only bringing a type of implementation science through clinical decision support, which we already see some great examples of, but also tackling the problems of waste, harm, and overuse in the healthcare system, where emergency physicians can receive prompts, hopefully not aggressive prompts or prompts that they're going to tend to want to extinguish because they're annoying, but that can challenge them on certain clinical reasoning approaches and decision making and test ordering. And so I think there's a lot of promise in that approach. We know many of us are on the Epic system, and there's just a never-ending stream of innovations and developments through that electronic health record that I think can transform the way we provide emergency care. I mean, already I think many of us are using scribe type technology, which is allowing us to capture the patient encounter and efficiently transcribe that into a note that is used and will be especially time saving. But I think in terms of both ED operations, clinical decision making, and a really innovative way to teach our learners, there's a lot of really interesting things on the horizon. So that in a nutshell is how I would answer that one. If that's okay, Dan.
Great, thank you very much. So you basically are saying that EBM will be integrated through these platforms in the next decade?
I think it's already happening. The potential is there. So we're, for example, doing a trial in Calgary, where I'm based in Canada, where we are automatically using elements of the patient's history, physical, as well as their past medical history to calculate pretest probability risk scores for acute coronary syndromes. And all that is really within reach now that we have AI-powered tools and access to incredible amounts of patient-specific data that will allow a personalized approach to medical assessment. And hopefully it will also allow us to make more rational decisions at the bedside.
Great, thank you very much, Eddie. Let me go to Chris Carpenter. Chris is at Mayo Clinic and has done a lot of work on Journal Club as a teaching venue and place to improve or admit information, knowledge transfer, and implementation sciences into emergency medicine. Why do you believe that classical EBM is a teachable skill for EM residents and faculty, Chris?
Well, thanks for the question, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here as well. I think I have four parts to that answer. One is, really, do we have a better alternative in 2024 to this concept of EBM that was described decades ago? Is it eminence-based medicine, where the unit of evaluation is the radiance of our white hair? We use a luminometer to figure that out. Is it vehemence, that the audiometer tells us what the evidence is? Is it eloquence, where the suaveness of your suit tells you that this is the truth, and use a Teflometer to figure out if you're the suavest person in the room? Is it diffidence medicine, where you use the level of gloom and a nihilometer to say that this is bad evidence, this is good evidence? Is it nervousness where we use litigation phobia and use a sweat test to figure out if that's the best evidence? What's the alternative? That's part one of my answer. Part two is my experience. Designed this WashU Journal Club after the McMaster Evidence-Based Clinical Practice Workshop in 2004. Peter was one of my mentors there. And that journal club is sustained until today. We have a vignette, a PICO question, a reproducible search strategy designed with a medical librarian. We use a user's guide to the medical literature, critical appraisal form, and every single resident has to turn it in, whether they attend the journal club or not during the 4-year residency each month. The answer keys, and the bottom line, how we're going to use that information gets posted online. Then we've got an opportunity to revisit that same topic, that same journal club, that same discussion at the bedside each month or each shift in the emergency department. And the resident portfolio gets that EBM proof of concept put right into their portfolio so that 20 years from now, we can show what that resident did to gain some EBM expertise. I've had multiple residents that went through that process, go on to educational and department leadership roles. I was just on a meeting yesterday with a gentleman who's creating a heat illness clinical practice guideline using the skills that he developed at that journal club. I've traveled personally to 40 different EM programs around the world, specifically to see how they run their journal clubs and what their EBM curriculum looks like. And I've not seen a better approach. If I had, I would have adopted it and used it. And I published multiple textbook chapters and letters to the editor and journal articles about how to do EBM curriculum through Journal Club. And I've not really gotten a lot of feedback from the audience. That's the wrong approach. That here's a better approach. There's some missing elements though. Where's the compelling clinician level or patient level outcomes data that shows that patient outcomes are really improved by this approach? I don't have it. The EBM talks about this hierarchy of evidence, yet there's a 1999 systematic review, or it's actually a case control study by Bazarian that showed that this critical appraisal skill set did not improve outcomes of patients in the emergency department, but they had a very small sample size, no archived or spaced repetition learning like we did at the WashU Journal Club, and they used a non-validated outcome of knowledge acquisition, not the Fresno test. So I think we need more data to show that this approach really works, but this is why I still think it's a teachable skill set.
Well, you've spent a good portion of your career developing and disseminating Equator network reporting guidelines for implementation science. What makes implementation science additive to classic EBM? And I'll just add here that the definition of classic EBM, the combined use of experience, best evidence, and patient preferences and values to develop an approach to a clinical problem.
Well, I look at chapter 2 of the 2009 textbook that Peter and Michael and Eddie were editors of, that evidence-based emergency care. Chapter 2 in that textbook is knowledge translation. And the last chapter, the user's guide to the medical literature, focuses on moving from evidence to action. So this concept of implementation has been on the minds of EBM leaders for many years. I just returned from the Oxford Teaching EBM course a couple weeks ago, and I served at the McMaster Evidence-Based Clinical Practice Workshop for many years. And my perception is that if we simply teach EBM concepts without actually showing the clinicians how it improves patient care, the process of care, the outcomes of care, it's just an academic exercise without any real clinical utility for lifelong learning. So you have to connect the two. And that's where implementation science comes in, because it shows us that once we critically appraise the evidence, found it to be practice enhancing or practice worthy, and show the clinicians and the patients how we can actually incorporate this into practice. That's what implementation science brings to the equation. My contributions, like you said, are this Equator Network reporting guideline on how we actually conduct research in implementation science and report it in a transparent way. And things like the context where the implementation occurs, the social and the economic, the policy and the healthcare organization, and separate reporting streams for implementation and the intervention. The description of the implementation framework, there's 400 different implementation frameworks that have been described thus far. Why was this implementation framework selected for this project, and how is this the best fit? The adaptability of the implementation approach and the fidelity to the implementation approach. Obviously, those are things that balance each other. The contextual changes that occurred to make this implementation strategy successful for this problem in this setting, the scalability of the problem, and the pathways to disseminate it once you found something that works. That's what implementation science brings to the table. And I think that with the STAR reporting guidelines, we had a little bit more focus than the user's guide did in the years past, but there's still things that are missing there. The user's guide doesn't have a critical appraisal form for implementation science research. I think that needs to exist because it's a separate science, a different strategy of conducting research with different outcomes. But you don't know how to critically appraise those studies because nobody's developed that critical appraisal form yet. And we also have to think about de-implementation science, which is not just implementation science in reverse. The implementation has to occur, I think, concurrently with implementation science for implementation science to be successful. And we're going to need our reporting standards and a user's guide critical appraisal for de-implementation science as well. So that's why I think implementation science is an important piece of this puzzle.
I assume by de-implementation science, you're referring to research that challenges concepts and practices that we've been doing for years and kind of encourages or challenges us to change those practices and bring them more up to date.
Yeah, the implementation science, we know it takes 17 years to get 14% of the evidence into routine practice. It takes about 3 times that long, I think, to get cemented practices out of practice. So 17 years for 14% of the evidence is a long time. 3 times that long is a lot longer. And de-implementation has different names. It can be de-adoption, de-prescribing, but it's the process of taking out outdated practice, outdated protocols, and putting in this new best evidence that really does change the outcomes of care in a favorable way.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Ken, let's go to you. Ken Milnes from UCLA, and going to talk a little bit about AI. So the question is, will AI be able to perform critical appraisal of the medical literature and replace EBM gurus like us in the future?
Thank you. I'm not from UCLA. I'm from Canada. I find it very hard to follow Chris Carpenter because he's obviously the smartest guy I know. And so I get to come on as this rural Canadian guy. But I'm currently doing a PhD in artificial intelligence at Oxford, where Chris just was for the evidence-based medicine course. It was excellent, wasn't it, Chris?
It was
I'm
excellent.
looking for some neurofeedback there. Yes, I think we will be replaced, but it depends on how you define replaced. You know, our uniqueness and distinctiveness will be added to the collective of the artificial intelligence. I think just a key aspect is that we've got to keep the human in the loop. And where that fits in is where my thesis is driven. Where are we going to have the human in the loop of artificial intelligence? Because AI can do stuff much better than I can do it, much better than even Chris Carpenter can do it with regards to searching large language databases, or even what Eddy Lang was talking about, searching patients' past medical history, current medications, current laboratory tests, and ECG findings. It can do that quickly and then provide it to the human for the executive function. Because Dan, you previously mentioned as a classic EBM practitioner, you still have to use your clinical judgment and engage with the patients about their preferences and values. And that is the art of medicine. And I absolutely welcome AI overlords to come in and allow me to be a clinician. And I think that, Eddy, if you're using AI scribes, which I've started using in the last month, it is so liberating. It is game changing. I'm allowed to now look at the patient and interact with the patient fully without focusing in on being a data entry clerk. So at the end of the day, I think that AI will be a great way to augment evidence-based medicine, an excellent opportunity to elevate the human condition and cut that KT window down from what Chris said was over 10 years for 14% of the information. We can do better. And so I like to always say, the kids are all right. We'll figure this out. It'll just be fine.
Great. Can AI be used on shift ethically and responsibly to improve care to our EM patients?
Yes. Just like any other tool, it can be used ethically and responsibly, and it can be used nefariously and not responsibly. And so issues around AI usually center around fidelity of the information. So is it hallucinating? Is it making things up? And privacy. And so as long as we're ensuring that we have high fidelity with regards to the information, and we're making sure that the patient's privacy is paramount, I think we can use it ethically and responsibly. But it's just like any other tool. I mean, you can take your charts and put them in your car and leave them in the garage and in the parking lot. That's not very good, right? You can make the same errors just on an electronic scale with AI. So we just need to make sure that we're using it, that we're protecting patients' privacy, and that we're not falling into the fact that just because it's displayed on the screen, it's true. So we may maintain some healthy skepticism.
So basically, you're saying that to maintain fidelity with AI, we still need to review our records and review our charts and make sure that AI really did say that this AI scribe really did say what we actually said and what we did. in
Yeah,
our
we do. We need to verify that. And also, when we're doing that, we're correcting our own errors and catching our own missteps and mistakes. That's what I find when I'm using AI scribes, and it's elevating my care and improving my care. And so I'm looking at AI not as a replacement. It's not a dichotomy, AI or humans. I think it's an augmentation.
Great, thank you. And finally, Mike Brown, you can talk about Cochrane Collaboration.
I'm at Michigan State University, which is green and white, but both football teams lost this weekend, so it's okay.
Oh, well, our condolences. And I did know that. So I'm going to talk a little, Mike's going to talk about Cochrane Collaboration and bringing AI to EBM. How's Cochrane Collaboration recommending the use of AI systematic review tools?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So, just for those not familiar with Cochrane, it is a charity based in the UK. Started at Oxford, where Chris and Ken still are. And so I do receive an honorarium from Cochrane for my editorial work. I'll just declare that. But, as Peter said, the EBM mission hasn't changed. Similarly, the Cochrane mission hasn't really changed. We still aim to be a trustworthy resource for making healthcare decisions. And so, as an organization, we do have to take this monster on in terms of AI. How can we utilize it, as Ken had said, a tool in our armamentarium, summarize the best research evidence to inform our decisions as healthcare providers or patients or those that provide policy. So Cochrane actually is being very proactive on this, and they just actually formed a new AI methods group. These are the methods groups at Cochrane are the ones that wrote, for instance, the Cochrane Handbook on how to perform systematic reviews, meta-analysis. And this effort, this new group, doesn't just include Cochrane, traditionally healthcare, but also we are working in collaboration with the Campbell Collaboration, which is more social care, environmental evidence, because we realize that the evidence synthesis community overlaps with those that are doing a lot of evidence synthesis in the world of environmental or climate change. So, and the JBI is also involved with this methods group. And their goal is to ensure that AI does not compromise the principles of research integrity and make sure that if it's used, which it will be, it's just used in the best way possible. So they have actually are in the process of publishing a series of papers that I can include in the chat, a link to it, but it's in the Open Science Framework. The acronym is RAISE, RAISE, for Responsible Use of AI in Evidence Synthesis. And I'm going to stop there for now. I can answer more questions later.
All right. Well, Ken talked a little bit about tasks where AI can be used in critical appraisal. You had mentioned something about using AI for risk of bias assessment as an example of that process.
Yeah, in fact, go ahead.
Now, how well do you think that works?
Yeah, so I am the lead editor for open access journal called Cochrane Evidence Synthesis and Methods, and we just posted a call for papers addressing this issue. And we've had a really excellent response, over 10 papers that'll be published in the series. And some of these dealt with searching for the best evidence, as was alluded to earlier. But I thought the most interesting paper, since I'm not an information specialist, I found the ones related to doing a systematic review where it could replace or at least augment humans in this endeavor. And 3 papers stood out. One demonstrating that if you want to write a plain language summary of your systematic review, there's some large language models that can do that very well with the proper prompts. Another one is already, to Ken's point, it's not replacing humans, but instead of having a second person, human, do your data extraction, it's been shown that it does a pretty good job at extracting data about 85% of the time correct. So it's not perfect. It makes mistakes, but it could act as potentially a second, reviewer to do the data extraction or risk of bias for that matter. And then obviously there's always adjudication required when there's a disagreement. And so that would still be necessary. That call for papers went beyond just healthcare. It also included our colleagues in environmental science. And we're going to continue to work together on how we can best harness the power of AI in this field of evidence synthesis. So thanks.
All right, great. I have another question. I'm going to go back to Eddy, something that you mentioned about the integration of AI with the EPIC tool, or the EPIC process, the use of that in your medical records. And I get the feeling from the way you describe it that you have to integrate this one diagnosis or one test at a time.
No, I think well, I mean, maybe at one time, but no, now it's far more sophisticated and it can definitely process multiple entries at the same time. I think the key buzzword, at least as it is currently here is in Canada, is what we call the learning health system, which is the idea that you're not only going to be using external sources of evidence and recommendations from guidelines to build guidance within your electronic health record, but you're going to also be using your internal data and using the information and wisdom that you can gather from your own internal hospital system data sets to help guide your decision making in practice. And that gets to the idea of the personalized medicine and being able to use, whether it be even better staffing patterns or, better ways of alerting clinicians about optimized dosing and drug interactions. All of those things I think are possible now that we have much more sophisticated data sets and can leverage those to really elevate our practice and make it much more evidence informed, both from external evidence and from the evidence that we collect on a daily basis from our patients. Thanks.
Great. So at this point, I think if any of you have questions, please put them on the chat and we'll try and get to some of those. So I want to sort of kind of sum some of this up as far as where does EBM get used in emergency medicine? And we talked about the old days, using it, learning how to just critically appraise studies and using it in that context, using it at the point of care for just-in-time learning in Journal Club. I want to add using it in peer reviews, something that we don't really talk enough about and need to be doing much more of to make sure that the scientific literature stays robust and accurate. And then in terms of policy making and advising, we got a little bit into that. I don't know if any of you want to add anything about that, especially considering the changes in the US healthcare system in the last 10 months that have threatened the integrity of our policy making and advisory process.
Well, Dan, I would just hop on there, just speaking from a Canadian perspective and having had the privilege of working with the WHO on a number of guidelines. They're in big trouble now. A lot of the funding for their guidelines came through USAID, and the fact that the funding has been cut through that institution really threatens the mission of the WHO and risks really having guidance become stale and not kept abreast of current developments. So I don't know exactly how the WHO is handling this, but it's really been quite tumultuous, as I think we're also seeing with the CDC, other agencies that produced evidence-based guidelines and in a rigorous way. So not only the threats of misinformation and disinformation, but pulling the plug on the resources that we've relied on for quality guidance is, I think, quite worrisome. Just my thoughts. Thanks.
Within our specialty as well, emergency medicine does not have a grade-based clinical practice guideline. We had GRACE at SAEM for 5 years, but SAEM pulled the plug on that. The Clinical Policy Committee, ASAP, has never had the stomach to do grade-based clinical practice guidelines. They make clinical policies. The Europeans, the Australians, they don't really want to create clinical practice guidelines. So we don't have them in emergency medicine anymore, those grade-based rigorous clinical practice guidelines. So it's not just the World Health Organization.
which relates to a question for Mike about threats created by AI to create fraudulent research.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Eddie. I think you posted the question, and it's a really interesting one. Cochrane has been talking a lot about this. And in fact, on the editorial board, we're working through how do we tackle this problem because in some preliminary research, we know that over 140 Cochrane reviews include a fraudulent study or a problem with retraction. So it may not be fraudulent, but it's been retracted for some reason. So how do the authors update those reviews? And we're working through a pathway for that. The review may stand as is if it was sort of a minor issue related to the retraction, didn't change the point estimate, for instance, but really important issue that Cochrane is tackling. And then in that question, you also, Eddie, included a question about the inspect tool, which really addresses more problematic studies. They may not be retracted, but there are serious concerns about the trustworthiness of that particular study or trial. And the inspect tool is it seems to be a reasonable approach to that problem. And just in our last editorial board meeting, we talked about we're not going to require every author to use that, but we certainly would support them if they did. We don't need to add burdens to the already challenge of writing a systematic review. And so we have to be careful what we require for our authors to make sure they're done expediently when we need answers. But thanks.
I would just interject that it seems obvious to me that the greatest threats to the integrity of science, validity of information, and healthcare in general are coming from people, not from machines. And that's a somewhat serious comment in that I emphasized the importance of social processes as a factor in conceptualizing how research information is integrated into practice. But those social processes can themselves be corrupt and corrupted. And I don't think we have a fix for this. I don't think it's up to EBM or to this kind of endeavor to fix it. I think we need to understand it and deal with it within the context that we work. One thing that's impressed me in terms of my meager knowledge of AI is the open AI stuff is one thing, but if a resource is embedded within a healthcare system, it becomes more trustworthy. Some medical students where I am developed an innovation which potentially is very interesting because to the extent that it were able to be integrated and licensed into the health sciences library, for example, it could do things that really are beyond the resources of most evidence synthesis. And it can do them in a very trustworthy, transparent way. So there is a distinction between just freewheeling AI programs and language models and resources developed within a trustworthy setting to begin with.
Anybody else want to respond to that? I have a question for the group about, you mentioned social processes, and I'm going to get off on a slightly different tangent about social processes because AI, one of the issues that I personally see about AI is its deleterious effect on the environment. AI uses tons of electricity and tons of water, basically out of proportion to what any other similar tool uses. What do you guys think about the social determinants of AI, the social effects of AI, and how we should approach that?
I'll just say I'm not an expert at all. The only reason I'm going to respond is because Cochrane is, as I mentioned, working with some bodies that are interested in climate change and the impact of some of these issues have on human health ultimately. And so there are people, working on that, but it's beyond my scope. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, the general question I'll ask then is, or specific question I'll ask is, so we can use AI as scribes in our clinical work. are we going away from saying using budding medical students for scribes? We have the same issues. They take down all the information, and the only difference being that they don't somehow look at it in some other context or something. And personally, not knowing enough about AI, I can't quite frame this as well as I'd like. But it seems like they're not going to use as much electricity or water, so they're going to have less of an impact. And we're going to be teaching, exposing them to clinical practice, which is a positive social outcome for our young people. We're going to be providing jobs. So we're going to be having another human interacting with the patient, which patients probably like a lot. Why should we be going to AI when we have this other resource that has other advantages that may outweigh the whatever advantage AI might provide?
I like working with human scribes, Dan. I favor your position. I think if I had to put on the other hat and argue the counter, the AI does not call in sick. It doesn't have to go to lunch. And it probably is cheaper than this, what we have to pay for the human scribes. But I support your position.
I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on this.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I feel that the trends in AI scribe are really posing a great threat to the human scribe venture. And I bet that places that had been using medical student scribes are probably moving away from that because of the cost advantages and the efficiencies. There were also some problems with medical scribes in terms of power dynamics and almost sometimes slave labor environments. So can't argue against AI scribe from that point of view. But I think the horse is out of the barn. I don't think we're coming back to human scribes anytime soon because of the efficiencies and the game-changing nature of the AI version of it. Thanks.
All right. I've got a question from an EMS provider. As an EMS provider who reads the literature often and continues to learn about how EBM can be utilized within EMS, how can get one more academic ED physicians to stay current on EBM best practices? This
Dan,
sounds like a challenge from our EMS colleagues when they
Dan,
see us not practicing best evidence. Go
I
ahead.
could take initial stab at it just because it's a recent interest of mine and in our department, some of the faculty. And the reality is, unfortunately, as we all know, probably EMS, it's very hard to do high quality research in that chaotic environment, in the pre-hospital environment. So a lot of the evidence base is weaker study design by its nature. And so we have a huge research gap in that arena, which needs to be closed, but we need that high quality research before we can create high quality evidence, forms of evidence synthesis, and then inform guidelines. So we've got a long way to go. It's not that we can't do it, but we need that first base of the pyramid to be built up over the next decade.
And I think and Bill Toon, who asked that question, gave a reference in the chat. And I'll ask Bill and Dom to kind of print out the chat and send it to those people that were on the site and maybe attach it to the recording of this session. So the way I asked the question related to academic EDs, how about in community EDs, where there's less of a process of trying to be up on the best evidence because we have to impress our learners, our residents, and our students? Is that different, or is that still the same answer? I mean, I think that what the question is, if EMS is challenging our knowledge, especially in community EDs, where some providers might not be up on the most recent evidence or might not be willing to use resources such as Cochrane and some of the other compiled resources. But how can we get more of those community physicians to be involved?
I think that's a really difficult question, but I think Chris probably would have the best answer, especially now in his role at Mayo. Like Grand Rapids in Michigan, where I'm at, we do have a number of rural EDs that we work with. And so we're fortunate in that many of our physicians that practice at the sort of mothership tertiary care center also are the same physicians that are working in some of those rural EDs. So as Peter mentioned, the community of practice that knowledge can spread via that chain in that scenario. And I'm not sure, Chris, with all of the Mayo rural EDs, is that happening, do you think, where the knowledge that the residents might benefit from, cutting edge knowledge, is spread through a community of practice through the Mayo system?
I have not seen that yet. I think that would be the ideal state. I think that we need to create pathways for these physicians and the non-academic who spend most of their time in the non-academic sites to want to learn new information, not to force them to do it. And it needs to be a minimal time investment for them because they work a lot of clinical shifts. And we've not found the perfect solution here at Mayo yet. No.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that in emergency medicine and EMS, we have something fairly unique. We have what I would think would be a fairly uniform manner of doing cardiac arrest and resuscitation. In Canada at least, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, which is the equivalent of the AHA in Canada, we take all of the guidelines coming out of the ILCOR group, that's the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, and those are translated into pre-hospital algorithms fairly uniformly across the country, and how cardiac arrest care is taught in courses, both for lay people doing CPR, advanced life support, and in the emergency department environment. So I think we have a kind of a unique model for disseminating EBM in how ILCOR and the relevant councils like the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, AHA, and the European Resuscitation Council take that work, adapt it to their local environment, and to some degree, I think we have pretty standard, uniform, evidence-based care based on that approach. And I don't think that exists really in any other specialty. So something to look positively about. Thanks.
Chris, would you like to expand a little on your comment in the chat about the number needed to treat?
That's the number needed to read. I was responding to William Toon. He had talked about how to get the non-academic sites involved, and I was bringing up Ann McGibbon's work from 15 years ago. And I think her number needed to read to find one article that changes my practice on my next shift. For emergency medicine, the lowest number was 26, as I recall, for annals. I think New England Journal was something like 11. And so it just says that these journals that we get have a lot of articles in there that may be building a foundation of knowledge, but they don't change how I care for patients tomorrow. And we need to get a fast track for these rural physicians so that the material that changes their practice on the next patient that they see is what we get in front of them so that they can adapt practice where it needs to be adapted. Otherwise, it's too big of a hill to climb for these folks. That was my point.
Great. Well, we're kind of running out of time, and I'd like to give everyone on the panel 5 seconds or 2 seconds or something like that to just say something if you'd like, and then I think we'll end our discussion. So I think everyone's talked out. So thank you very much. I want to thank Chris Carpenter, Pete Wyer, Mike Brown, Eddy Lang, and Ken Milne for being on this panel with me, and appreciate your insights. And it certainly lays out a lot of areas that we're all going to be working in for the next decade or two, I hope. Thank you all again.
And thanks for great moderation, Dan.
Thank you.
It's been a
Thanks
pleasure.
everyone for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.